Hello, I'm Venus with Galaxy Ink, and for this week's writing tips, we are on part 4 of our Elements of Writing series. I know that I keep getting it wrong in my introduction, so I keep saying like the style of writing or elements of style, and some of that's because there's books called that, and I think I'm getting them confused in my head. It is the Elements of Writing series though, the actual name on the series list. So this week we're going to be talking about setting. Setting can include things like history or historical time periods, culture, geography, time, like time of day or year, and immediate location. It's really important that your readers be able to see what's in your head and it be out there on the piece of paper for them to actually read. It doesn't have to be super descriptive, but it does need to be something, or the reader just doesn't know what's going on. They don't understand where they are in the setting. So I think when we're talking about setting, the first thing we need to talk about is what is too little. And this is something that I see a lot in first drafts. And that makes sense. You know, you're just writing away and you're like, you know what, I'll put the description of this place in later. I'm busy. I want to get this out of my head. You know, and so you just move on. So what happens a lot of times though is you're missing a lot of description. And so for me, what I would consider too little is just non-existent, right? But I would also say that too little would also be if the reader can't see it. And what I mean by that is, do your readers know where they are? So let's say somebody's in an office and you didn't, not enough description or no description would be, we don't know where they are. We don't know they're in an office, a house, a car, like what's going on. Where are they, let's say the character's on a phone call. Where are they taking this phone call? Is it in their office? Is it in their car? That kind of says a lot. That can help build the story, right? So that's the first thing. So let's say that it's in an office. So now where are they? Does the office have chairs? Does it have bookshelves? Is it kind of a boring cubicle office? Or, you know, have they made it their own by adding pictures? These are all things that you can add. And these things tell stuff about your characters too. So you're not just describing the physical location, you're also describing your characters within those settings. Do they feel uncomfortable? Is this maybe not their office, it's somebody else's? And so they feel really uncomfortable while they're taking this phone call in somebody else's office. You know, it's the only office in the whole place that has a door, so this is where they take phone calls, that kind of stuff. This all says a lot. And the same thing for houses, museums, schools. How are your characters interacting with this space? We also need to remember when we're talking about interactions that most people don't just stand still. I've talked about this before in other videos when we're talking about dialogue. Most people don't just sit there and do nothing. We're fidgeting, we're playing. You know, people are standing there talking to you, and as they're talking to you, they're going through your books. They're looking at the things in the office. They're looking at the things in your home. You know, we don't just sit there and do nothing. So that also interaction and having physical objects for your character to be touching and looking at is really important as well. And that builds the setting and the character. So if we're thinking about real people, and thinking about even my own home, you're looking at a corner of my library, and this is actually a room that is set aside as a library in my office. I love this room. This room says a lot about us. It's the first room you usually see when you walk in the door because of the way that the door opens. So you walk in and you see a wall of books. And that says a lot about me and my husband, and the type of books that are on these shelves and the way that we've decorated and things like that. That says a lot about us. So you have to remember that your characters have those things too. They have homes and offices and places. And even if they're a stranger to those places, they will interact with those things as a stranger would interact with them. If you've never been to the city before, then how does the city seem to an outsider? If you've never been to New York City, for example, maybe it wouldn't be as glamorous as you thought it was, or maybe it's more glamorous than you thought it would be. You know, either way, that's a way of showing character development and also setting. So where characters are forced to spend their time also says things about them. I think of books that take place in schools where the kid doesn't want to be there, you know, and their interaction within that space and how they, you know, maybe they're always trying to find ways out, or, you know, you're talking about a character, like I've talked about Fat Angie before, where she walks down a hall and she's just trying to make herself as small as possible within the space. And that says a lot about her, but it also says something about the space that is around her. So now we swing the pendulum to the other side and we look at too much description. What is too much? Well, that is kind of like beauty in the eye of the beholder, because for some people, too much description is Stephen King. And for others, too much description is Jane Eyre. And what I mean by that is Stephen King's pretty famous for writing a lot of description, very verbose kind of descriptions of places and things. I don't usually need that much description. For me, just a couple sentences to just kind of familiarize me with the space, the smells, the sounds, and then I'm good to go. I don't need 2 or 3 paragraphs to describe a hotel or a house or a neighborhood or a city. But some writers like to do that, and people love it, so people will read them. What I consider too much, like way too much for me, is Jane Eyre. So if you've ever read Jane Eyre, there is a whole chapter about a red room, and it goes on, and everything in it is red. I mean, that's all you need to know. It would take up a paragraph, but for some reason, Miss Bronte thought that an entire chapter about the red room was very important. And I've heard many different analyses of why she wrote that verbosely about it. Still doesn't work for me. I just kind of find it boring. And I'm like, no wonder this book is so thick. She has to describe everything in ridiculous amounts of detail. So for me, that's too much. But some people love that book, so they don't care as much. What you need to do, though, when you're writing, and especially if you're writing modern fiction, is that we need to look at setting as trusting our readers that they'll get it. So, describe what you need to, but trust that they're going to understand and get what you want to tell them. Especially if you're talking about kind of a modern place. It's a little different with fantasy because you're creating a new world, and so it's really hard to do that, to trust your reader to get it. But again, there's a good way to do it, of course. Only include what your readers need to visualize things. Don't repeat yourself. So I do see this a lot when people are trying to go in these strong descriptions, and they'll say, the buildings were tall and broad, and they were, big brownstones. And then the next sentence, it's like, every building was tall and the brownstones stuck out, which to you, you're probably thinking, oh, well, yeah, that's the exact same sentence. Yes, that's the exact same sentence. But to them, they feel like they have to make sure that you understand how big and tall these buildings are. So they're going to add these extra sentences in, and they're not necessary. Sometimes you just have to go back and fix it as your story grows. You'll start to describe something, or maybe you have your characters go to a new city or a new town, or they are interacting with a new space, and there's just either you didn't put any description in, or maybe this story has evolved after that. So what you've done is you've created a fantasy village. You describe it at the beginning as being, small and dainty. There's, only 4 shops, but later on you're describing the village as having guards and a wall. That doesn't sound like a village. That sounds like a town now. So suddenly our village has grown to a town. You need to go back and fix one of those instances, whichever one, you want to go with. But if you're going to add guards, now we're not in a tiny, dainty little village with 10 villagers, right? We've now become a town that needs protecting and guards and things like that. So you're going to have to go fix that. You also need to remember that some writers are just more descriptive heavy, and that's okay. Classical literature, modern literature does that. Some authors include not a lot. Some authors include just a little bit. I think that this is part of your writing style or tone, which we're going to actually talk about in a week or two. But I think it's really important that you understand that this is your writing, and setting is very important. Your readers need this. But it's okay if it's not a lot. Just make sure there's some. And it's okay if there's a lot. If you've like, man, I want people to understand exactly what this town looks like. They need to understand that it's this shape. Or they need to understand where the docks are, because that might be important later in the story. Or I really want people to get an understanding of how culturally rich this setting is. And that ties into the next thing, which is culture. Culture is a part of setting, including things that kind of give those little hints at how the life is. And this is especially important in fantasy and sci-fi and historical fiction, where you're trying to set up a world that your reader is probably unfamiliar with, or may be unfamiliar with. If you want people to understand how London smelled in 1870 and how it wasn't all beautiful cobblestone streets the way that you see in a lot of movies, then you're going to have to really describe that and really get that across to your readers so that they understand. And it doesn't have to be a lot. You just do 1 or 2 sentences, but got to get in that little bit of that smell or stench that was London in 1870. Same thing with fantasy. If you want to create a rich setting, you're going to have to add these little details. I think of the Daughter of Smoke and Bone when she goes to the city for the first time. There's a lot of really great, rich details about the city that are so different from where she grew up in that really paint this very good picture. And it wasn't overly long or verbose. It was very simple, but it was very clear. And I do recommend reading that book because it did such a good job describing setting. It's hard not to do too much with sci-fi and fantasy because you need to leave a lot out. But my recommendation when it comes to setting for kind of more fantasy worlds and historical is to space it out a little bit. Don't drop it all in to the first paragraph and tell us everything about this world. Or I even see this mistake with a lot of fantasy and sci-fi is creating like a prologue that dumps all that information in there. It was a world full of wonder and rich and like, hold up, slow down. Let's ease into this world a little bit. Also, maybe we should start with some character development in the beginning too, rather than just dropping us into setting, because a whole first chapter of setting is kind of, We also need to think about geography, place. Where are you within a space? And I don't mean just like New York City or London or Paris. I mean geography, like how does the climate change? Are there certain cultural things that happen? I think of New England in the fall with the leaves, but you've also got apple picking. That's the kind of thing that I think of that also is setting. So they go apple picking every fall because it's now fall in New England. It's a little chilly. The weather's a little chilly. If you're setting your story in August in Florida, maybe there's a threat of a hurricane coming. If your story's set in the summer in California, maybe there are forest fires. Sadly, these are things that you have to think about though when you create geography. And when you create your fantasy worlds, they need to have geography too. Is it cold where they're at? I know that Game of Thrones is very good with this. The authors created a very fantastical world, and there are places that are very cold and there are places that are warmer, and there's places out in the ocean, all these different things, these geographies that build culture. And I think that that's one of the biggest strengths of the Game of Thrones series, is that there is so many different characters, but there's so many complex cultures. Each of these different houses, different locations have these cultural distinctions based sometimes off of just their location of geography. The cold, winter is coming. Those things are really important, and they add this kind of like wealth of information into your story. And then there's time, time of day. A story is going to look very different. The setting is going to be very different if you set your story in New York City, geography, at 3 a.m. It's going to be very different than 3 p.m., right? So you have to keep that in mind when you're creating your stories. Make sure your readers know what time it is. I also get on new writers about not knowing how old characters are. You're 3 chapters in, you're like, I don't know if this character's 20 or 40. I really wish they would have let me know on page 3 or 1. This is the same thing. Really important that we know where your character is and what's going on around them. And then lastly, we have immediate location. We've got time, we've got setting, we might know where they are, but like, what is your character doing like in the moment? Are they walking down the street while having this phone conversation? Are they in an office? Are they at school? Are they at the house? You've got to make it clear where the character is, what they're doing. And I don't mean that you have to follow this checklist. Remember, space it out a little bit. It doesn't all have to be there in one chunk. It was a Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. and she was talking on the phone while walking down the street on the way to her cousin's house. Okay, let's slow down a little bit. Let's start with the conversation add in that she's, walking down the street, or add in that she almost trips over, a stone in the middle of the path as she's walking because she's not paying attention. And then we start building. We start building our character. We start building our scene. We start building our world. We kind of take our character and we start panning out. And then we go back in. You have to think of it almost like a movie where we're taking these moments. But unlike a movie where readers are seeing, or people are watching and visualizing, you have to paint that picture for them. You have to treat it like a green screen. They can see your characters because you're writing dialogue, but they need you to fill in the blanks of what's going on. So I always want to leave my videos with a little bit of a, if you want to do a bit of homework or analysis, look at a book that maybe is your favorite. Just think about it. A book that is your favorite book, and imagine it in a completely different setting. Think about that. Think about what would happen and how different a story would be if it took place in a completely different setting or time period, or even some of your favorite scenes if they happen somewhere else. And you'll realize very quickly, if you don't already, that the setting and making sure that your readers know where they are is very, very important, and basically an element of writing, an important element of writing. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing tips almost every Friday. If you think you're ready to hire an editor, you can check me out at galaxy-ink.com. I've been Venus with Galaxy Ink. I hope your writing is out of this world.